Hey everybody, it's time for the matchup we've all been waiting for. How does the 2018 model of the AtGames Sega Genesis Flashback compare to the Sega Genesis Mini? First things first, some ground rules. I'm going to compare these two consoles without the use of any third-party hacking software. So no HackChi for the Sega Genesis Mini and no extra hacks for the 2018 Sega Genesis Flashback. The two systems are going to be compared as they were released. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair. I'm going to rate both systems on a few different categories such as appearance, controllers, the user interface, the game selection, and how each system compares on a utility level. For example, how many features each system brings to the table. The first category I'm going to rate both of these on is their physical appearance or their aesthetic in comparison to the original Sega Genesis. Let's take a quick look at both systems and their controllers. Here's the two systems side by side. So the first thing we notice is that the Mini is significantly smaller than the Flashback. As a matter of fact, I think you could probably fit two of these Minis in a Flashback itself. As far as the physical characteristics, you can see they're both molded pretty similar. They have the same outer shape. They both have an on-off switch, a reset button, and a volume slider. Or do they? One of the first physical differences is that the volume slider on the Flashback does not move. It is purely aesthetic. It has no function at all. Whereas with the Sega Genesis Mini, the slider can be moved up and down. It still doesn't have any function. You can't actually use it with headphones because the headphone port on the front is a faux port. It is fake. Taking a closer look at the buttons area, you can see that the Flashback lists the reset button as a menu button. Also, even though the volume slider doesn't move, it has a different appearance than the one of the Mini without the red stripe or the numbers to the left. The on-off switch is different as well. It has the same shape, but is lacking the stripe down the center. Both systems have that shiny circle around the middle of the system, as well as that shiny part in the middle with the 16-bit label. The shade of red is different between the Flashback and the Mini. The Flashback actually gets this correct because the original color on the Genesis was this shade of red. Speaking of the 16-bit font, it is pasted on the Flashback, while on the Mini, it is actually raised up, which is accurate to the original Sega Genesis. Both systems do have the cartridge slot, which opens up. On the front of the Flashback, you have your two controller ports with the labels Control 1, Control 2 on opposite ends of the port. Same thing goes with the Sega Genesis Mini. It looks like the systems have a similar font for each controller indication, but again, the main difference is that the Flashback appears to be stamped in, while on the Sega Genesis Mini, it is sticking out. In terms of appearance, we're pretty much done with the Flashback. We have a couple more things to talk about with the Mini. On the bottom of the Mini, you can actually remove this piece. And this is accurate to the original because this is how you would attach it to the Sega CD. And just to show how accurate Sega got with the appearance of the Sega Genesis Mini, they actually included the correct amount of dots in the reset button, as well as the correct amount of ridges on the side of the system. One more difference between the two is the Sega Genesis logo in the middle. You can see here that the font is in a white with kind of a background, whereas with the Mini, the font is black on a gray background, which is more accurate to the original. Both systems did get the Sega logo correct. As for the appearance of the controllers, starting with the Flashback, you have a 6-button controller here. The D-pad is on one of those circular discs, and it comes with a on-off switch on the top. The controller has the same shape as the original 6-button, but the buttons and the coloring is not accurate. Whereas with the Sega Genesis Mini controller, this looks exactly like the original. In terms of design and everything included, the start button is in the correct position. You have the A, B, and C buttons with the red in the middle with trigger above them. And again, you have the circular disc D-pad with the white dots and the triangles in the up, down, left, and right positions. This is the exact same size as the original Sega Genesis controller as well. Now we're going to get a little more in-depth with each system's controller. Physical hardware functions for both controllers. Well, the Mini controller is a lot larger than the Flashback controller, but it only has 3 buttons. The Japanese version does come with 6 buttons, but we did not get that here in the States. The Genesis Mini controller is a USB controller. You can use this on other devices. The cord length is about 6 feet. The Flashback controller is a 6-button controller. It has a menu button in the center that'll take you directly to the menu, as well as a rewind button which allows you to go back in your game and replay a section if you wish. Flashback controller will take 2 AAA batteries. It does have the on and off switch, which allows you to turn off the controller if you do not want to waste the batteries. Both systems come with 2 controllers each. There's no difference with the second Sega Genesis Mini controller, but the 2-player controller for the Flashback does not have the buttons that the first player has. This is actually a little useful because you can tell which controller you're picking up right away. In terms of how each controller functions, well, I've never been a fan of this disc type D-pad. You can see that the Flashback D-pad sticks out a bit more than the Sega Genesis Mini D-pad. One thing I do need to mention, on one of my Sega Genesis Mini controllers, the C button would keep getting stuck. It would still function, but it acted like it was pushed in all the way, and after a few presses, it would finally come out, but I did want to make note of that. I did not have any issues with the Flashback controller. All buttons function normally, the D-pad felt just as good as the one on the Sega Genesis Mini. The Flashback controller is notably lighter than the Sega Genesis Mini controller. The Flashback controller is a 2.4 GHz wireless controller, no cords here. This is my living room. It is an average size living room, and it has a common setup that you'll find in most homes with the location of the TV and the couch. Due to the cord length on the Sega Genesis Mini, you may run into this situation where the cord just isn't long enough to reach from your TV to your couch. The cord will reach, but you can see I don't get to sit comfortably. I have to kind of sit forward a little bit, hunched over. And the cord being stretched across the room like that is blocking anyone from walking from one side of the living room to the other. And if you have kids or animals in the house, this can be an issue. With the wireless controllers of the Flashback, that is not a problem at all. You can sit anywhere you want in the room, and as comfortably as you want. How about each system's menu or user interface? There's not a lot that separates these two from a Raspberry Pi or some other single board computer, but the user interface is what makes these systems unique from those. Taking a look at the Flashback menu first, it has this nice gray and yellow aesthetic. It has the name of the system in the top left corner and the menu right below it. It's easy to see which menu you're on by the bright yellow stripe, and each game is highlighted by a yellow cursor. The box art appears large on the screen and is very detailed. At the bottom of the menu, you have the list of the controls and what each button does. When moving through the menu or selecting games, you hear a click for each option selected. Here's the background music for the Flashback. Here's the menu for the Sega Genesis Mini. It's very bright, the colors shine nicely. I really like that background with the stars and the grid for the floor. Each game has large box art and the title is very clear on the bottom. Also, the indication with how many players and the type of game it is really nice. And one of my favorite features of this system is hitting the B button to go into bookshelf mode. To be honest, I do like this feature, but after a while I stopped using it simply because I did all my work on this main menu here. The settings and the sort options at the top are clearly visible. On the Sega Genesis Mini, you have a beep sound instead of a click. Let's listen to the menu music, which was created by the composer for Streets of Rage 2. And now for the games. This is going to be hard to rate because I can't judge each system on the quality of games because everybody has a different preference as to what the good games are. A lot of people like the Sonic games and I personally do not. So I can't knock the systems for having games that I personally don't like. But what I am going to look at is the number of games, the diversity, and how well it represents the original Sega Genesis. Also how well these games are emulated on each system. When you take a look at the list of games for each system, you can see that they share a few, 16 to be exact. Alex Kidd and the Enchanted Castle, Altered Beast, Columns, Comic Zone, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, Eternal Champions, Golden Axe, Kid Chameleon, Phantasy Star 4, Shining Force, Shinobi 3, Sonic Spinball, Sonic 1 and 2, Vector Man, and Virtual Fighter 2. That leaves the Genesis Mini with 26 exclusive games and the Flashback with 34. That's 8 more games than the Genesis Mini. Although it is kind of a moot point since you can add any game you want to the Flashback with an official firmware update to include every game that is on the Sega Genesis Mini. It's not the prettiest, you don't have box art or anything like that, and for some reason the system doesn't organize them alphabetically. But again, any Sega Genesis game you want to play on the Flashback, you can just add it on an SD card. With the inclusion of a 6-button controller, the Flashback does have an edge over the Mini when it comes to Eternal Champions and Virtual Fighter 2. One game specifically that does play better on the Mini than the Flashback is Mega Man: The Wily Wars. That game has always been hard to emulate because it runs slower. And to counter that, Strider seems to run better on the Flashback than the Mini. I noticed when I was doing my live stream that the sound effects when swinging the sword rapidly would just disappear. Last but not least, it's time to look at the features of each system. What does each system bring to the user experience that's different from one another? Another feature of the Flashback Mini is actually on the system itself. On the front, you can see that you have 2 controller ports, but they're not USB. You can actually use your original Sega Genesis controllers with the Flashback. And not only that, when you open up the cartridge port, there's a cartridge slot inside where you can use your original Genesis games. And last but not least, on the side of the system, you have an SD card slot where you can use an official AtGames firmware to add more Genesis games to your system, basically giving you access to every game released for it. As for the menu features, the Genesis Flashback allows you to select between your recently played games, an alphabetical list of all the games on the system, Sonic games, bonus games, your settings information, the About screen where you can scan a QR code. Below that is a cartridge games option which will be lit up if you have a physical cartridge inserted into the system. And below that is the SD card option where you can play any games you've added via an SD card. Some of these settings in the Sega Genesis Flashback are the ability to back up your saves to an SD card, restore them from the SD card, and delete all your save states. You can turn the background music on or off, and there is an overdrive function here. According to the instructions, this is used for some games that need a little bit more power, so if I had to guess, this is something like an overclock. Right above these settings are your bezel options. With the Flashback, you have 4 bezels to choose from, like this one, the blue and green with the controller in the corner, the black background with the blue grid, the one with the blue and pink geometry, and the retro style with the stars in the background with the round hills. Hitting the A button on a game will bring up a large description as well as the controls for that game. While on this screen, hitting the menu button will add the game to your favorite selection. Alternatively, you can hit the start button to open a game automatically without that description coming up. The recently played option is a nice addition when you want to get right back into the game that you left off last time you played. While in-game, hitting the menu button brings up the menu immediately. From here you can select your save slots. On the Flashback you have 5 to choose from. Hitting the C button on a save slot will delete that save. In the bottom right corner you see how many save slots are left available on the system. The other option in this menu is the ability to apply the scanline filter while in-game. And then of course the last option is to quit the game directly from your controller without having to get up and hit the button on the console. As for the Sega Genesis Mini, you have various sort options with alphabetical, by genre, by number of players, and by release date. The Genesis Mini gives you 8 language options, as well as 2 screen settings. You have the regular 4:3 or widescreen. Hitting the C button will apply a CRT filter to either type of screen setting. With the Sega Genesis Mini, you're given 2 wallpaper options. You've got the blue crosshatch background and the background with the 2 speakers and Sonic in the corner. When selecting a game, you are given the release year as well as a small description. Going into the menu while in-game gives you your save state options. You have 4 save states available to you. You can also reset your game or return to the main menu. You can hit the C button over one of your save slots to lock that data so it's not accidentally saved over. Although hitting the menu button on the console takes you to this menu quickly, you have to hold the start button for a few seconds before the menu pops up. It's hard for me to knock the system on this because the other mini systems did not have this function at all. My overall thoughts on each system. Well, the Sega Genesis Mini outclasses the Flashback 2018 model in terms of aesthetic. It looks exactly like the old Sega Genesis. Flashback does a really good job, especially compared to the older models that they used to put out, but in terms of the amount of features, Flashback beats it. It has more games, it has more bezels, it has the backwards compatibility with the old Sega Genesis cartridges and controllers. Not to mention the wireless controllers are way more functional than what's on the Sega Genesis Mini. It has a better CRT shader, and in my opinion, an overall better emulator with Genesis Plus GX. And of course, the nail in the coffin was that the AtGames allows you to add your own games without hacks. It may not be pretty, but you can put any game you want on it. AtGames really stepped their game up after the whole Sega Genesis Mini fiasco, and they showed they can make quality products. You have the Atari Flashback X, which just released, and of course the Legends Ultimate Arcade. I just wish it wasn't so hard to find one of these because it is so worth it. Especially for those hardcore Genesis fans who kept your old stuff, this is definitely the system you want to get. So let me know what you guys thought. Do you think the Mini is actually better than the Flashback? Did I miss some points? Do you prefer the appearance of the Sega Genesis Mini over the features of the Flashback? Again, let me know in the comments below. That's all I have for you guys, so as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is the part of the video where I thank those users who support the channel through YouTube memberships and Patreon. Eric Cologne, Jordy Alex, Mike Muniz, Sam Torres, Dor, Yaroslav Orudzov, Den Cardoso, Andre G, Randy Day, Travis Morton, Rick67, and Batman.